Right, we come to the second statement. I call the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy.
Well, with permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a statement on the situation in the Middle East. I was very disappointed to miss yesterday's Foreign Affairs debate due to the EPC summit, and I welcome this early opportunity to come to the House. Last weekend, I visited Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, meeting leaders on both sides. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has also spoken to both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas, and I've discussed the issue with colleagues from the G7 and, of course, the region. This has been a priority from day one because of the desperate situation in Gaza and the serious risk of escalation in Lebanon in particular. And I have to be frank, Britain wants an immediate ceasefire. The fighting must stop. The hostages must be released. Much, much more aid must enter Gaza. Israel promised a flood of aid back in April, but imposes impossible and unacceptable restrictions. And there must be de-escalation on the Israeli-Lebanese border. I sincerely hope the parties agree a ceasefire urgently. And I've been discussing with partners the need for planning for what follows, on reconstruction, on governance and security, and for reforming the empowering the Palestinian Authority. But President Biden presented his proposals almost 2 months ago. So this new government has not sought to cloak our position with qualifications or conditions. The horror must end now. Mr. Speaker, my visit brought home the conflict's appalling impact. I met the families of those murdered and taken hostage so cruelly by Hamas, now separated from their loved ones for so long. I told them that the UK will continue to push for an immediate release of all hostages. I also met Palestinians displaced by settlers. Settlement expansion and settler violence has reached record levels. The Israeli government has seized more of the West Bank in 2024 than the past 20 years. This is completely unacceptable. This government will challenge those who undermine a two-state solution. Finally, I met aid workers from the UN agencies operating in Gaza. More aid workers have been killed in Gaza than at every conflict globally combined this year. Those who risk their lives to save others are heroes. With journalists banned from entering, aid agencies are also a vital source of information from the Strip, and their reports are devastating. Almost 40,000 killed, mothers so malnourished they cannot produce milk for their babies. Rivers of sewage in the streets, a surge in disease among children, 40 times the normal rate of diarrhoea. Polio now detected. Looting, with one aid truck driver killed only yesterday. I announced on my visit the new funding for field hospitals run by UK Med, who have treated more than 60,000 Gazans since the conflict began. Mr. Speaker, humanitarian aid is a moral necessity in the face of such a catastrophe, and it is aid agencies who ensure UK support reaches civilians on the ground. UNRWA is absolutely central to these efforts. No other agency can deliver aid at the scale needed. It's already feeding over half of Gaza's population. It will be vital for future reconstruction, and it provides critical services to Palestinian refugees in the region. I was appalled by the allegations that UNRWA staff were involved in the 7th of October attacks. But the UN took these allegations seriously. I've spoken to UN Secretary-General Guterres and Commissioner Lazzarini. We are reassured that after Catherine Colonna's independent review, UNRWA is ensuring they meet the highest standards of neutrality and strengthening its procedures, including on vetting. UNRWA has acted. Partners like Japan, the European Union and Norway have also now acted. This government will act too. I can confirm to the House that we are overturning the suspension of UNRWA funding. Yeah. Britain will provide 21 million in new funds, some directed at supporting the management reforms recommended by the Kelowna Review, and UNRWA supports more than 5.5 million Palestinians. Almost 200 of their staff have died through this conflict. I thank them for this life-saving work. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we also look for a pathway out of the wider crisis. I'm conscious of this conflict's complexities, determined to listen to all sides and approach every decision I must take carefully. Our overarching goal is clear: a viable, sovereign Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. There is no way out of this crisis without a route to both Palestinians and Israelis enjoying security, justice, and opportunity in lands that they can call their own. We are committed to playing a full diplomatic role in a renewed peace process and to contributing to that process by recognising a Palestinian state at a time we determine, not anyone else. I know there are other aspects of the crisis that are of great interest to this House. The government's assessment of Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza, the investigation by the International Criminal Court, and what further measures might help deter malign activity by the Iranian regime. Let me reassure the House that I take these issues extremely seriously. Our commitment to international law is clear. We are following the necessary processes. As soon as I took office, I tasked officials with a comprehensive review of Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law, and that process is now underway. I will update the House again once the process is complete. Mr. Deputy Speaker, 24 years ago, just weeks after I first joined this House, President Clinton hosted the Camp David Summit, a reminder that this tragedy has lasted far, far too long. There are those in this House who, like me, represent constituents convinced the world does not understand Israel's predicament. To them I say, Israel is in a tough neighbourhood, threatened by those who want it annihilated. There is no equivalence between Israel's democratic government and Hamas, a terrorist organisation responsible for an act of barbarism on October the 7th that sought to kill countless Israelis and provoke wider conflict with Palestinians. I fully supported the UK's role in defending Israel when Iran launched its unprecedented attack, and I utterly condemn the Houthi attack on Tel Aviv overnight. There are also those who, like me, represent constituents convinced the world does not understand the depth of Palestinian suffering. To them I say, civilians in Gaza are trapped in hell on earth, and the Palestinian people have been in purgatory for decades, denied the state that is their inalienable right. As Foreign Secretary, I understand both these perspectives. I recognise the pain and anguish felt on all sides. It makes me only more determined to do all I can in this office to advance the cause of peace. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Opposition Spokesman Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And can I start by welcoming the Secretary of State and his shadow team to their places. They take up their roles in one of the greatest offices of state, who are committed to shaping the future and the safety of our country. And that is, after all, the foremost duty of our government. I'd also like to take this opportunity to put on record my thanks to Lord Cameron, Lord Ahmed, and of course the Shadow Foreign Secretary, for their steadfast determination towards ending this conflict, their humanity that they displayed when faced with a situation of untold horror. And I'd also like to thank them because in my previous role as Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, they kept both me and both opposition frontbenchers fully updated, and I'm sure the government will continue with this collaborative approach. I also thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement, although I cannot say that it prepared me fully to find myself on the front bench this Friday morning. The Right Honourable Gentleman will know of the extensive work we undertook in government following the horrific terrorist attack suffered by Israel on the 7th of October and the crimes against humanity suffered by her people. I welcome his visit to the region. Mr Deputy Speaker, Israel did suffer an appalling terrorist attack. It was the deadliest in their history. And as we said from the outset, Israel has the right to defend itself in accordance with international humanitarian law. And we must remove Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel. As the Right Honourable Gentleman rightly sets out, the situation in Gaza is desperate. Too many Palestinian civilians have been killed. We continue to see strikes on humanitarian infrastructure, and the humanitarian situation is unforgivable. The Index on Famine states that Gaza is now in just that, full famine. And I saw this when I went on my own visit to the Egyptian border with Gaza and met with families who had to be evacuated due to the severity of the harm caused to them. We need an immediate end to the fighting and to secure the release of the hostages, whose families continue to suffer unbearable torment on a daily basis. So can he please provide an update to this House on reassurances he has received on the safety of those hostages? On aid, has he secured any reassurances in his meetings to increase the number of trucks going into Gaza, because 70 odd a day is just not enough? In government, we did everything we could to urge Israel to let more humanitarian aid into Gaza, opening more crossings, whether through Rafah. We trebled our own aid commitment within the last financial year, doing everything we could to get aid there by land, sea or air. We had success in getting the Ashdod port open, as well as Karim Shalom, as well as helping in 11 airdrops into Gaza and creating a field hospital. The UK aid funding to UK Med has treated thousands of patients. We also supported and helped set up a maritime aid corridor to Gaza. Now, he announces today the return of funding to UNRWA. Can he please advise the House on the timeline for this and also provide assurances that taxpayers' funding will be directed with due regard? Now, only an end to the fighting will enable a significant scaling up of humanitarian aid. Now, Right Honourable Gentleman rightly states that Biden set forward a proposal backed by Israel and the UN Security Council to end the hostilities. So what action is the Right Honourable Gentleman taking to move that proposal forward? Can he also provide us with any reassurances he has secured in his meetings with Netanyahu? He also rightly raises the case of extremist settlers. We put in place sanctions against some of those extremist settlers, one of the first governments to do so. So can he assure us that he raised this issue with the Israeli government and whether more sanctions will be forthcoming? Now, the risk of escalation remains high, particularly with Hezbollah in Lebanon. So can I please ask, following the sham election of the Iranian president, whether his department assesses any change in Iranian intent, activities or funding? When he sat on these benches, both the Right Honourable Gentleman and the now Home Secretary were crystal clear that they would prescribe the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps would they be in government. So can we please now have the timing for this prescription? We all want to see an end to this devastating situation, which threatens the stability and security of so many. As His Majesty's loyal opposition, our priority will be work with the government, but also to challenge and scrutinise you as needed. But ultimately, we on these benches can assure you we will always work in the national interest, because it is foreign policy that keeps our people safe at home, and that is our foremost duty.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Rutland and Stamford for her remarks in the House this morning and for her work previously on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, in which she was a stalwart champion for international humanitarian law, and she raised these issues frequently in the House, challenging both sides on the issues that she thought was important, and I'm pleased to see her elevated to this position. And can I put on record that I am grateful for the work that I was able to do with the former Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, and the way that he kept us in opposition in those days up to date with what was happening in our national interests. And of course, to the member for Sutton Coldfield, for all of his work, particularly on the issue of development when he was in office. She asked me about the safety of the hostages. This is of primary concern. And of course, in detailed conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu, we were engaged in what support we can offer to assist in that business of getting those hostages out. I met with hostage families, many of them UK hostage families, to discuss the plight of those hostages. They remain paramount in this government's mind, as I hope we head towards that ceasefire that we all want. She's right to centre her remarks on the question of aid. 70 trucks a day, when we know that it should be 500, is not enough.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And all of this House recognise the phrase flood. We were told in April that they would flood Gaza with aid. 70 is no way near enough. And as a consequence of that, when we hear the stories of disease, now polio, setting in Gaza, it is horrific and troubles us all deeply. Let me reassure her that we allocated an extra 5.5 million to support UK Med in Gaza, because those field sites are so important against a backdrop in which hospitals and medical facilities have been pummeled and bombed into the ground. She's absolutely right to focus on the Biden plan. We would like to see that Biden plan adopted in the next few days. And it's my sincere hope, and this dominated discussion with G7 foreign ministers in Washington, D.C. Last week, and in the conversations that I've had with Arab partners, all of us want to see that deal done, and sincerely hope that we get to that point by the end of this month. There is a sticking point. The sticking point, of course, is with prisoner release as well as hostage release. And the sticking point is what happens on that day after. I think Israel's security is paramount. Hamas cannot remain in charge of Gaza. But equally, the IDF cannot remain situated in Gaza. There has to be a new paradigm. It will involve, I suspect, Arab partners and others that can give the security guarantees to Israel. It's a complicated picture. We have to work at pace at what comes afterwards. She's right to raise the terrible situation on the West Bank. It was very important for me to meet with the new Prime Minister on the West Bank to discuss the finances that have been withdrawn, to discuss the free bar situation that we saw on the West Bank, and the horrors of an unbelievable expansion against a backdrop in which this breaches international law that this House stands by. And I press the Prime Minister in Israel on this issue greatly, and of course we are looking closely at those issues. And on Iran and the role that Iran plays in sponsoring Hamas, sponsoring Hezbollah, and engaged in malign activity, we keep a close eye. And I stand by what I said at this dispatch box as opposition spokesman on these matters, and I will work over the coming months to review the context of terrorist activity and state threats with my colleague, the Home Secretary, in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah. Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend to his position. What discussions has he had with regard to a hostage deal to secure the release of the hostages, and can he inform the House as to the welfare of the remaining hostages?
It has now been many months indeed. It is sadly possible that some of those hostages are no longer alive, and there are some reports that some of them have lost their life. When I spoke to hostage families, aware that their, in this case, sons may be no longer with us, of course, like any parent They wanted the body returned. But then there are hostages still in tunnels. Parents, brothers, sisters, families, unaware as to their health at this point in time. And we will continue to do all we can, working with Israeli authorities and important nations in this regard, like Qatar, able to speak to Hamas in a way that this government is unable to do, to ensure their release.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. May I welcome the Foreign Secretary to his place. The situation in Gaza is, frankly, soul-shattering. It's been 300 days nearly. The death toll is at 38,000, the vast majority killed being women and children. Only 3 days ago, 22 people lost their lives in a strike on a UN-run school. That's the 5th attack on or near a school in the last 8 days. And those who survive the bombings are at severe risk of disease and malnutrition on the backdrop of a medical system that has been completely decimated. So can I warmly welcome the restoration of funding to UNRWA as a backbone of Gazan society. But the number of deaths will only increase exponentially with the finding of polio. In the Lancet, it was estimated it might reach 186,000. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this has to end now. We need that immediate ceasefire, but we need also those hostages out and the aid to come in. But it is also right we start thinking about not just the next day, but how do we stop this from ever happening again? And there is only one viable answer to that, and that is the two-state solution. That is our North Star. It's the keystone to stability in the region as well. But I have to express disappointment that the Foreign Secretary refuses to pull the lever that would best signify our commitment to it, which is to recognise the Palestinian state on 1967 borders. Ireland, Spain and Norway did it this May. Will he consider it? And if he won't, why not? The Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, actively rejects a Palestinian state, and we know that it is Hamas's rallying cry, the fact that it doesn't exist. We must prove them wrong. So what is he doing to ensure it will happen? The ICC also has issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu, Gallant and Hamas leaders, but there is confusion over the Foreign Secretary's position on the block. Will he clarify that for the House today? And finally, would he consider meeting with me so that we can work together across the aisle to advance the cause of that immediate ceasefire, but most important, that enduring peace and that two-state solution?
Hear, hear.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, not just for her remarks, but for the ways that she has taken up these issues in the last Parliament, and I'm sure she will continue in this Parliament. And we are all reminded of the plight of her own family in Gaza in those early months particularly. And can I welcome her support for the restoring of funding to UNRWA. Many of our allies made that decision now months ago, back in April, May. I'm only sorry it has taken a change of government to look at this clearly and reach this point. And she is absolutely right to raise the issues of huge concern in relation to polio taking hold now in Gaza, alongside the tremendous growth in respiratory disease and, of course, in diarrhea. And it's right to say that both those two conditions can lead to death if untreated. There is no confusion on this party's position on Palestinian recognition. We are committed to Palestinian recognition. We hope to work with partners to achieve that when the circumstances are right. And I say to the Honourable Lady that it is my sincere hope that that Biden plan is adopted in the coming weeks, that we get to the immediate ceasefire that this party has now been calling for since, well, it's now a good almost 8 months since we've been calling for an immediate ceasefire. And under those circumstances, we can work with others because Palestinian recognition is not the end in of itself. It is actually a two-state solution that is the end in of itself that we want to achieve. And she's right to say that the Chief Prosecutor at the ICC has made his intention clear in relation to arrest warrants, but she will know that there are further hearings to determine whether they will actually be issued. We have been 2 weeks in office. It is right that I allow Treasury solicitors, lawyers and the Attorney General to assist me in any judgments that we would have to make in relation to that. I said in my statement there was a process. It's a quasi-legal process. It's one that must be followed with all integrity, and I intend to do that.
Paul Waugh.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement today, which is a real relief, particularly his description of the hellhole that is Gaza. Many of my constituents in Rochdale feel deeply appalled by the ongoing death and suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza, but they're also deeply appalled by the rising tide of settler violence and expansion in the West Bank. And many of them are really desperate for peace in the region, as many of us in this House are today. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary specifically what specific steps he's taking to actively promote and uphold the independence of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice?
Well, can I state very clearly that we are clear. Sorry, I should welcome the new member for Rochdale to his place. It's great to see him there. I know he long held an ambition to move from journalism to this House. We are clear that the International Criminal Court is the primary international institution for investigating and prosecuting the most serious international crimes, and we respect fully the rules-based order and the ICC's independence and impartiality. And on the ICJ, we're of course aware that there is an advisory opinion likely to be issued very shortly, and we will consider it very, very carefully.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. I welcome the Right Honourable Member to his role, and I think both sides of the House want to see critical aid getting through where it's needed. But I am concerned by the government's decision to resume funding to the UNRWA. UNRWA schools have been repeatedly used by terrorists to both store weapons and launch attacks, and over 100 UNRWA staff have had links to terrorist groups in the region. Is the Right Honourable Gentleman able to give the UK taxpayers the reassurance that they need to know that an unequivocal assurance that Hamas has no links to UNRWA in Gaza?
Well, can I say I had the pleasure of meeting Catherine Colonna in her role as the Foreign Secretary for France. She's a woman of tremendous capability and integrity. She looked at these issues in depth. She reported, and all of our allies have continued to fund UNRWA. But she did make a series of recommendations, and of course that was why I spoke to the UN Secretary General and the Commissioner Lazzarini, responsible for UNRWA, to ensure that they are implementing the action plan that came out as a consequence of that review. And in finding the money available for UNRWA and restoring its funding, I've also ensured that there is £1 million of funding to ensure that we support the implementing of those recommendations.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for the work he's done moving government policy on this issue and for putting the situation in Gaza at the top of his agenda. In particular, can I commend the fact that he and the Prime Minister have consistently called for international law to be followed in the conflict. When will he publish the government's assessment of whether any parties have breached international law since the 7th of October and what the consequences of any such breaches should be?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that question, and I know that he has been a champion of the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people in this House for many, many years indeed. He pushes me on an important subject. Can I say to him, and he's an esteemed lawyer, so he understands why I'm choosing my words carefully, this is a quasi-legal process, and it's important that I follow the actions in the appropriate way, with all probity and all integrity. So I will consider those assessments when they are made available to me. I instigated a process on the first day in office. I am supported, of course, in that by our Attorney General, and I hope to be able to make my views known with full accountability and transparency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Could I welcome the Foreign Secretary to his place, and I welcome the decision to restore UNRWA funding and the overall change of tone from his predecessors on this issue. Liberal Democrats have long called for arms sales to Israel to be suspended whilst there are questions over their human rights record. As Shadow Foreign Secretary, he called on the then Conservative government to publish the legal advice they'd received on this matter. Will he commit to doing so now?
Well, the Honourable Lady will have heard what was just said to the member for Hammersmith and Fulham, although there may be boundary changes that means that I've got Chiswick. It's now changed. Hammersmith has gone more upmarket. It's Chiswick, forgive me. You'll understand as the member for Tottenham, I think I can get away with that. But in all seriousness, because it's a very serious point, I will seek to make my decision with full accountability and transparency.
And any more?
Thank you. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's announcement on UNRWA, whose work I know well and which saves lives in the face of unbearable horror, and whose work we must be careful of believing misinformation about. Earlier this year, in one of the only hospitals still functioning in Gaza, I met a mother whose child had been injured by an Israeli airstrike. She asked me to tell the world what was being done to the Palestinians of Gaza. With almost 40,000 killed, she assumed we didn't know. Because if we knew, surely we would have acted to stop it. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that as well as an immediate and lasting ceasefire, accountability is essential in upholding international law, and that the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice are doing vital work on Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, which must be supported and acted on? And will he meet with me to discuss such issues?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and many in this House will know her considerable work and the work of her colleagues on behalf of those suffering in Gaza over the last few months, and will also know just how hard and unbearable it has been for many, many of those working on the ground. She makes an important statement about the independence of the work of the ICC and the ICJ. And I believe, and I think all Democrats in this House should believe, in the separation of powers. Yeah. It is for judges and the judiciary to have the time and reflection to make their considerations, and it is for politicians to step back and respect them in that process. That is the case domestically in our own country, and it must be the case with international courts of law. And of course, I will meet with her and other colleagues and keep them updated.
Alicia.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary and his team to their places, and I welcome the statement that he has just made. In particular, I welcome the emphasis on the need for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate release of all hostages, and I welcome the emphasis on the need for a stop to settler violence and expansion in the West Bank, as I also welcome the resumption of funding to UNRWA. As a couple of honourable members have already emphasised, I would like to add my voices to the calls for the Foreign Secretary to commit to publishing the comprehensive review of Israel's compliance or non-compliance with international humanitarian law as soon as it is completed by officials. And I would like to ask the Foreign Secretary, through you, Mr Deputy Speaker, if he will, in the meantime, apply the precautionary principle and act to stop all UK arms exports to Israel, given that there is widespread evidence of considerable breaches of international law already. Thank you.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady's remarks, and I welcome her to the House representing North Herefordshire, I think, on behalf of the Green Party. Can I say to her that she will recognise, and I said in my remarks, that it is the case that this is one of the toughest neighbourhoods in the world, and Israel is a country surrounded by people who would see its annihilation. It is being attacked by the Houthis. It is being fired, missiles firing from Hezbollah, notwithstanding the desire for Hamas to wipe Israel off the map. For those reasons, it would not be right to have a blanket ban between our countries and Israel. What is right is for me to consider the issues in relation to offensive weapons in Gaza in the normal way, following the quasi-judicial process that I've outlined.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome my right honourable friend to his place and congratulate him for giving priority to this particular issue on behalf of my constituents of Warwick and Leamington. Can I commend him for today's announcement? The restoration of funding to UNRWA is long overdue. Many other nations, as we've heard, did this many months ago. Given their importance for the supply of 60% of aid into Gaza, 50% of food as well, we heard that 70 trucks a day is way insufficient compared to the 500 estimated to be needed. My right honourable friend may be aware of the Oxfam report, which shows that there's been almost a systematic use of the weaponisation of water by the IDF in Gaza. We've seen a reduction of 94% of supply of water, just 5 litres per person per day. Given what my right honourable friend was talking about in terms of dysentery and polio, what does he believe the UK can do to assist the restoration of water supply in Gaza?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and for his continuing champion of these issues. He's right to mention the importance of water. And when we talk about the numbers of people, I think it's 500,000 people now at category 5 on the definitions that constitutes starvation and famine. A large part of that is no access to clean water. And of course, he knows the scenes and the sight of sewage also in the system, and the lack of clean water is a desperate situation. In the end, what we need is a ceasefire, because it's only with a ceasefire that the reconstruction work can begin.
Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend was absolutely right to speak of the need for an immediate ceasefire. He was absolutely right in talking about the need to restore the funding to UNRWA, and I welcome both those moves. He also spoke of the government needing to make an assessment of Israeli compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza. But the question then arises, after that assessment's been made, what is going to happen? He said in his statement, the horror must end now, and indeed it must. But he's just explained to another honourable member that actually to cease supplying arms to Israel would cause, as he sees it, a greater problem. What is the leverage that he has? Because if the horror must end now, and it must, then this government must be able to take some actions once it has reviewed and received the legal assessment that he has called for. I'm prepared to give him time to get that assessment, but I want to know what he's going to do once he's got it.
Well, my right honourable friend is very experienced. He's experienced to know that the minute any individual describes his leverage, the leverage is lost. So he'll forgive me, I'm not going to share that at the dispatch box at this stage. But the passion that lies behind his question is a concern that for 9 months, foreign secretaries have stood at this dispatch box and they've said that the aid must get in. They've said that we must follow international humanitarian law. And months later, there's a new foreign secretary at the dispatch box, and there are serious concerns about international humanitarian law, and the aid has simply not got in the quantities. So he shares my frustration, and it was frustration indeed that I shared with leaders in Israel.
Emily Darlington.
Sorry, Speaker. I wasn't bobbing, but happy to ask a question. Are you sure it was me you were calling on?
Please go ahead, because the clerks are struggling a bit with new members. So,
first, I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend for his position and to his entire team, and absolutely congratulate and to thank him for the restoration of funding to UNRWA. As somebody who's worked in international development, I've seen the absolutely vital work that these organisations play, and in particularly that dedication to those organisations under the United Nations umbrella, because they are where we can come together as an international force. Would he agree with me that the solutions in the Israeli-Palestine conflict are not ones that are necessarily here, but ones that we have to work with our international partners to build? Thank you.
The member for Milton Keynes Central has got off to a good start. Can I say she's absolutely right. One, because we've seen so many aid workers lose their lives, but two, because her emphasis on the partnership that we have to strike with allies across the world is essential if we are to deliver the change that we need to see in Gaza particularly, but also, I think, in the occupied territories.
Poynton.
It's very welcome to see the Secretary of State and his team on the front bench as Britain's voice in the world. As a particular significance for me, as one of my predecessors in the Livingston constituency was Robin Cook. And I know Robin Cook's time in office and thinking has done much to inform the Secretary of State's approach to his new role. The statement this morning was incredibly welcome, although it did set out the horrific situation on the ground in Gaza. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that there is no peace without a two-state solution, and that those who are opposing a two-state solution is wrong for both Israelis and the Palestinian people?
Well, I'm very grateful to have been asked a question by the new occupant of Robin Cook's seat. I think a stalwart and a champion of this cause, and I was very grateful to come into this House when he was serving as Foreign Secretary, and in an article I wrote recently in Foreign Affairs, I paid tribute to his work over so many years. I have to say, the vote by the Knesset, Mr. Deputy Speaker, yesterday was hugely disappointing. We believe passionately in two states. And I say to those who reject two states, if you are a proponent of one state, then you do have to explain how everyone enjoys equality under the law. And if you are a proponent of no state, then you are effectively suggesting that occupation continues. And that is unacceptable to, I would have thought, all members of this House.
Florence Eshelem.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I congratulate and welcome my friend, the Right Honourable Member, to his role as the Foreign Secretary. I welcome his statement this morning outlining the restoration of the UNRWA funding. We on these benches have been calling for that for a long time. The Foreign Secretary will remember and recount that many of us have raised the issue of the humanitarian aid, including the fact that many aid organisations met with us throughout the course of the last Parliament, including Islamic Relief, who are based in my constituency. He told me the harrowing story 2 days after the 7th of October, when they lost contact with all their staff on the ground. But we know that a key issue with the aid is the blockages and the restrictions of the aid getting in. Can the Foreign Secretary outline how the blockades and restrictions will be lifted so that urgent aid can get in to the people who urgently need it?
Well, I'm very grateful for my honourable friend's question, and can I just congratulate her for her remarkable speech at the beginning of the King's speech. She has also raised these issues, and we have certainly shared a Christian faith and have talked about our deep concern as people of faith. Can I pay tribute to the work of Islamic Relief? Can I say one of the issues is that Rafah is now closed and it needs to reopen. And there is a real issue about not just the trucks getting across, but the distribution once they are there. And very sadly, the picture that has now been painted is of lawlessness in Gaza, widespread looting from the trucks that get across, and very sadly, a driver losing his life yesterday. So her question, as the people of Vauxhall and Camberwell Green would say, is on point.
Andrew Peggs.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to welcome my honourable friend to his position and welcome the restoration of funding to UNRWA. It is good to see when we talked about changing this election, we also meant an international approach of this government. I know he, alongside this House, will share in the revulsion at the ongoing horror faced by hostages, their families and innocent civilians in Gaza who are facing the enduring crisis. A revulsion shared by many people in my constituency in Peterborough. And it is a privilege to be a voice for them in calling for a ceasefire, a release of the hostages, peace and a complete solution to recognise Palestine. Can I ask him what message would he give to constituents of mine who have seen the discussion about a two-state solution for too long, that this time, with a new government, we actually have a new approach which will deal with the immediate crisis, but actually recognition of Palestine?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Peterborough, a city that he knows I know very well, having spent 7 years of my life in that great cathedral city. And I've knocked on doors with him, and I know that this is an issue of great concern in Peterborough. Can I say to him that we are absolutely committed to that two-state solution, that the global community for too many years have talked about it and not acted, that I recognise that now is there's almost tremendous cynicism when the phrase is used, but there is no way out of this crisis with a plan for afterwards. It must guarantee, of course, the security of Israel, but can I just say the Palestinian cause is a just cause. And we must work with our partners. We must build up the Palestinian Authority. And I spoke to them at length about what more we can do to assist them with the reforms that they need to make so that we can realise that. And he's absolutely right to put on record our deep concern for the hostages, for their families, for their plight. And if they were released, we could end this now.
John Slinger.
Speaker, and may I warmly welcome my right honourable friend to his position as the first Labour Foreign Secretary for 14 years, which is very welcome. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the UK's extensive, long-standing diplomatic, economic, cultural and defence ties with the Gulf, Arab and other Middle Eastern governments mean that we're better placed to bring our influence to bear, to work in cooperation with our international partners to achieve a two-state solution that ensures a safe and secure Israel and a viable, sovereign and one day, we hope, prosperous Palestinian state? And can he also assure me that all will be done to enable British organisations and companies to play their fullest role in rebuilding Gaza's infrastructure and economy?
What can I say to the new member for Rugby? It's a very good question, and it's why, in opposition, I spent so much time with partners in the region, talking to them about the future. All of them want to be engaged. All of them want peace. All of them want to move towards a series of normalisation. But they are all crystal clear. That cannot happen by ignoring the plight of the Palestinian people and setting up a roadmap to two states. They are not prepared to reconstruct Gaza for this to happen yet again in 25 years' time. So we have to work with them. They play a critical role, but we must now get to that immediate ceasefire.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and may I welcome the Foreign Secretary and his team to their places. And may I also strongly welcome the decision announced today to restore funding for UNRWA, which will be recognised by many people in South Birmingham as an important step, amongst many others, towards ending the horror that we see today in Gaza. The Israeli government's decision to end the legal routes for Palestinians to work in Israel has played an important role in the entrenchment of poverty and political instability in the West Bank, alongside the illegal settlement programme. Will he make representations on this important matter, recognising that both the Israeli Histadrut and the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions have an important role to play as pillars of civil society in both nations in the establishment of a lasting peace?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for the question. It gives me an opportunity to just talk about what I saw on the West Bank. The situation is febrile. It's anxious. There is tremendous hardship because of the withdrawal of those funds. It's phenomenally tense, and against a backdrop, people are watching their land being taken from them before their eyes. And so the representations that he asked me to make are absolutely the representations I made when I spoke to the leadership in Israel, because this simply cannot continue, and we must act. We must act to stop it.
Dan Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and may I welcome the Foreign Secretary and the whole front bench team to their place. It's wonderful to see. I want to welcome to the visit that the Foreign Secretary took to the Middle East and thank him for the time spent meeting the families of the hostages who've been held in Gaza for 9 months now. I want to ask that he will commit to doing everything he can to ensure that the hostages are released immediately.
Well, can I welcome my North London colleague to his seat? He represents a part of the country with a significant Jewish population, and I'm very proud in my own constituency of the Stamford Hill area of Tottenham, which is also an historic home of the Jewish population. And they are hugely concerned about the plight of hostages, and they worry that the discussion about hostages has sort of fallen off the lips of so many people. They worry that the horrors of October the 7th have been forgotten against the backdrop of this unfolding crisis and this war. And I want to reassure him and them that they have not been forgotten. And of course, the British government, and this is a cross-party issue, is working very, very closely with the Israelis and others to see their release.
That concludes the statement. We'll now pause for a second to let people leave quietly.